excited to have you all here with us today for hydroponics session with a really incredible teacher, Graeme Marcoux. So we've at Matt's Farm to School, we worked with Graeme for a number of years. He's been an inspiration to many teachers for the incredible work he's done with hydroponics and all sorts of garden-based learning. So you've got a really great teacher here today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Matt's Farm to School, we work to strengthen local farms and fisheries and promote healthy communities by increasing local food purchasing and education at schools. We have a number of different ways for you to get involved, from professional learning opportunities like this to different kinds of networking. We do a fair amount of state policy work, as well as communications or promotions of local food efforts. You may be familiar with our Harvest of the Month campaign. That's what the pictures are on the side of the screen, which we have both for implementation in a cafeteria environment and also in the classroom. So please reach out if you'd like to learn more about that. So Graeme has been teaching environmental science at Salem High School since 2005. And I'm going to turn it over to Graeme now to lead us through a session on how he has incorporated hydroponics into his teaching. So take it away, Graeme.
Thanks, Simka. All right, so I have set up the presentation to kind of take you through the basics of hydroponics, working under the assumption that people in the room maybe have never done any hydroponics before, and then kind of take you through what different systems might look like, from really, really basic, which are just as good as the really, really complex, or for those of you that are really trying to push more of the farm to school curriculum and really think about production, then we can talk about how it might be a little bit more complex. We'll take some time to talk about how the work that we're doing should be rooted in the standards, right? So we're doing really cool things with our students in order to help them learn the content rather than in spite of the content, right? Because that's going to keep us all working really successfully in the jobs that we have and want, right? And then we'll explore a little bit of various ways that you might make curricular connections depending on what content you teach. Now, I'm assuming that we have all grade levels here, and potentially even some people that maybe are working with some nonprofits, things like that, that visit schools, work within schools, but aren't part of schools. So, and then we'll save some time towards the end for any questions or clarification that people need, because again, I'm going to kind of glaze over a lot of stuff, and that way, if people need more detail, they can ask for it then, or if they want to talk a little bit more about implementation or ways to incorporate it into lessons or as part of the curriculum, we can get to that as well.
And I'll just add that feel free to type your questions into the Q&A throughout, and we'll be sure to refer to those when we get to that at the end.
Cool. All right, so let's talk about just the basics, right? So what is hydroponics? I think it's a lot more mainstream than it probably was even 20 years ago, right? People back in the day, it was really kind of a niche growing technique that was still not seeing a whole lot of use in a lot of places. But now we live in a world where there's major hydroponic industries that are growing lots and lots of food for us, right? So a lot of us are eating hydroponically grown food, and all the way up through things like teas and flowers, etc. That's all coming through hydroponics as well. So at the base level, hydro is referring to water, as many people know. And then the ponics piece, which is typically the mystery to a lot of people, is work or labor. So the idea there is that the water is doing the labor, or the work that the soil might typically do. What I wanted to show at the beginning here, because this is also a point of confusion for a lot of people, and it's not necessarily that one is better than the other, but there is a difference typically, especially in the classroom, when we're referring to something as hydroponic systems or an aquaponic system. So if we can go to the next slide, this showcases an aquaponic setup. So aquaponic setup are typically, if not always, linked to a fish farm or an aquarium or other kind of a live animal situation, right? So I say live animal situation because we have one set up here that's based on our turtle tank, in addition to ones that we have with our fish. And so the idea here is that you're not actually adding nutrients to the water for the plants. The nutrients are coming from the fish wastes. And this is becoming increasingly more popular, even at the university level, where people are exploring this topic as a means to look at sustainable food production systems for small off-the-grid communities in different parts of the world, where they can really closely monitor how much water they're using. They can produce a protein product from the fish that they're raising, and the byproduct of those fish is going to be vegetable materials that can go right back into feed for the fish, or it can go to feed in the community. You can go to the next slide. So this is an example of one of our major systems here at my school. So we have hydroponics and aquaponics. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see our largest fish farm, and that fish farm most recently, and I suppose for the past 5 to 10 years, has been growing catfish. And our lab is set up over 2 levels, and so we will pump water from the fish farm up to the to what is actually the 3rd level of our school, where it will run through some of the pipes that you see on the left-hand side of the slide to grow the vegetables. So the plants that are growing down in the bottom of that rack, those are all growing from our aquaponics system. And then the 8 tubes that are above in the top part of that rack, those are all growing hydroponically. So the water that's entering those pipes is coming from different locations. So it's certainly possible to run aquaponics and hydroponics in the same setup, and it's actually a really cool and useful way to show students the differences in terms of where you exhibit more or less control in the system. So in hydroponics, we're exhibiting the most control in our system, right? We're trying to control every variable from nutrient level to water quality to plant type, etc. In an aquaponic system, some of that is left to chance in terms of how much waste your fish are producing, and that might range based on how much they're metabolizing, and that could totally have to do with what you're feeding them and what the water temperature is and even what time of year it is. So your aquaponic system can be a little bit more variable. I will say though that our aquaponic system is one that we have probably used the most in like our biology classes to really teach nutrient cycling. So that's a place where we can really talk about how the fish will produce ammonia-based wastes, and those ammonia-based wastes will then need to be converted into nitrites and nitrates, and where we harbor bacteria to do that good work for us so that the plants can grow really well. And we can really showcase for the kids, what happens when we remove the bacteria from the system, and we can do water quality tests and really showcase those differences. It takes what is otherwise one of the more complicated biological cycles, I think, in the nitrogen cycle, and really brings it to life for kids. All right. So that is obviously a very complex system. That is not what I do on my everyday, right? So we obviously monitor those systems and we work with those systems frequently, but the best work we can do with our kids is when they can actually go from the designing of a system all the way through growing plants within that system. So on the left-hand side of the slide, that's probably the most basic hydroponic setup I've ever done with my students, and that's just wheatgrass, where we can really carefully select the water that's going into that wheatgrass growing operation, but there's really no moving parts, right? The kids can plant the seeds, there's grow medium in there, just like there's any other hydroponic system. It grows really rapidly, and they can kind of harvest the product afterwards to look at, movement of matter and energy in that system, right? Because those plants don't just materialize from nothing, right? On the right-hand side, that's actually a setup that I have sitting right next to me on my lab bench. This is one that my students just set up the other day. It was a part of my environmental systems class. That's just some hydroponic basil that's growing in what we'll go over later is called a deep water culture. And it's basically as simple as you can get. It's got a little aquarium pump, small Rubbermaid container, and you can really get creative with what kind of grow medium you're using. And the kids can get after it pretty quickly. All right, so for the basics of hydroponics, we're gonna kind of stick to some of the main ingredients. I listed a lot of the ingredients here, or components, just so that you're aware of what they are. And if you see them in the literature, it won't be a total mystery, because there is a lot of kind of academic language that comes with hydroponics, but there's also a lot of informal kind of hydroponic subculture language that can come through in the media. So if you're researching this stuff online, you're going to find that people that are doing hydroponic growing kind of are in all walks of life, and the chat is not always necessarily pushing what is in the more technical aspect of things, right, that you'd want to be using with your students. So when we talk about grow medium, a grow medium like the one I've got here, right? So this is just something that's going to hold the plant in place. Because you're growing hydroponically, you're growing without soil, you still need something to hold the plant in place to maintain its structure, regardless of how you're going to irrigate that crop. The one I'm holding in my hand right now is a Rockwool plug. Okay. We use a whole variety of them here, though. We've got peat moss plugs. Sometimes we'll use coconut coir. Coconut coir will come oftentimes in these bricks, and they just rehydrate them. And it's essentially, at its base, any of these grow mediums is just something that's adding structure that is not going to augment your water. So when we're controlling our hydroponic systems, we want to make sure that we're controlling what goes into the water, because that's what's going to go into our plants. And if our grow medium stands a chance at changing the chemistry of the water, then it stands a chance of changing the patterns of growth for our plants, right? So most of the best grow mediums are going to be pretty benign in that they're not going to change the chemistry of the water all that much. So Rockwool is an example of one that really won't change the chemistry of the water that much. Coconut coir, same idea. Expanded clay pellets, which is essentially just pellets of clay that look and act a lot like a ceramic pot that you would grow a seedling in outdoors. Perlite and vermiculite, you've probably seen those before in potting mixes. So those are just going to be high surface area, porous materials that allow water to drain readily so that your plant roots aren't saturated if you don't want them to be. And most importantly, allow the flow of oxygen into the root systems. Gravel and sand have been used historically. I mean, they will drain really well. They are really heavy, which is not always great for a hydroponic system, because you're already going to have enough weight there with the movement of water. You don't necessarily need to add sand and gravel, which are really heavy. But they also potentially will change the chemistry of your water more than some of these other materials. And so with your grow medium, your aim is permeability, so the water can move through it, and so that oxygen can move through it, but enough structure that it will hold your plant in place. On the right-hand side of the slide there, this is just one example. This is from our freight farm at the school, where we have a peat moss plug that was originally holding that chard in place. That's what we seeded into. And then as the plant grew, it required more structure. And so that peat moss plug was put into this large plastic mesh growing system. This is from Zip Grow. And that is strong enough to hold the weight of the plant. And then you can see the roots that are just absolutely gorgeous coming out of the bottom of that grow tower. The roots will just grow down through that grow medium and find that nutrient solution that you're feeding to it. Okay. All right, so the next major part of our hydroponic system, I mean, none of these supersedes any of the others really, but this is going to be some kind of reservoir and a distribution systems. So you want to be able to take your water that you are changing to meet the needs of your plants, and you want to be able to move it to where the plants are, or you want it to immediately get to the plants. So in one of the first slides I showed you, it was of our aquaponics and hydroponics setup, where it was a bunch of PVC. It looked like it was laying on its side on a rack. So that would be a nutrient film system. On the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see there's a bunch of radishes growing there. That's also a nutrient film situation, where the water is kind of creating a film along which the roots dangle into. So they're not necessarily submerged all the time. This one's kind of a combo though, because it has that white wicking strip behind that really just makes sure that the water finds the roots. So the water will move through that white piece of felt and get to where the roots are. An ebb and flow system, which is a, it can take a couple different kind of forms. The one that was on that last slide, we saw the tray of lettuce seedlings. That is really just a table that fills with water, and that it will ebb and flow. So the water will move in like the tide, based on a pump being turned on, usually by a timer. It will flood the table, and then after it is done flooding the table, the timer will go off, and then the table will just empty itself back into the reservoir. Ebb and flow systems, it's just important to make sure that they are set on a timer such that the roots never get totally dried out, because then your plants will obviously desiccate. And it is really pump heavy, right? So if that pump's not working, or the timer gets shut off, or your outlet trips or something, then you could come back after a weekend and find that your plants are pretty dry. Whereas in some of the other systems, you have a little bit more security there because you don't rely on that pump to flood the system. The buckets in the back of this picture here, we see some buckets back by the window. Those are an ebb and flow system as well. So that 55-gallon black drum in the picture is the nutrient reservoir. There's a control box that has a pump in it that will pump water out of the reservoir and fill those buckets. And there's a float switch in there so that the buckets don't overfill. It will fill them up. They will irrigate the plants, and then a second pump will pump the water back into the reservoir, and we can set that up for as many times as we want it to irrigate in a day. So on the left-hand side, you've got your nutrient film. On the right, kind of middle there, we've got our ebb and flow system. All right. So our nutrients and water. So nutrients, they are a really, really important part of the process. Although I will say that if you're growing in the classroom, they're not as important as people will make them out to be, right? If you're growing commercially, of course, you have to add nutrients to your water because you're trying to create a commercial product that's going to look, taste, and be awesome. In the classroom, you might just be looking for plant growth. And anybody that's ever done any kind of plant propagation at home will know that you can put cuttings into straight up tap water, and those cuttings will continue to grow, albeit maybe a little bit nutrient deficient. And so they'll still show growth and they'll still do really well. But I will say that the nutrients aspect is where you can do a lot of really great science if that's what you're teaching. So our primary ingredients, right, we're looking for that NPK mix that we'll usually see on a fertilizer bag. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then they'll typically have within them the dissolved micronutrients that are really, really important to plant growth. The nutrients are only as good as your water is balanced. So when we are measuring the nutrient load in our water, we use conductivity here at our high school. That's typically what's used most places, even though you might be accustomed to testing water for really specific nutrients like nitrate, nitrite, ammonia. If you are doing water quality testing, say for surface bodies of water, the nutrient testing that we're doing for hydroponics, the nutrients are typically coming pre-mixed in a bag. So even if you were to measure what specific types of nitrogen you're getting in your water, you're not typically going to be doing the work to modify at that kind of specific level. Most of the commercial nutrients you buy are going to be pre-mixed. And so even if you wanted to increase one thing, it would be pretty difficult to do so without just doing a different mixture of nutrients. When we're testing for the conductivity, we typically just use a probe. So I've got one here. So this is a pretty basic probe. This one is a little bit more than basic, I guess. We have gotten away with just using a simple Hanna Instruments pH conductivity probe that you might get in a water quality testing kit with great success. It's just important to make sure to keep them calibrated so that you know what your water levels are looking like. This one also tests for pH. So pH is also very important to be testing in your hydroponic system if you're looking for excellent growth. So plants take in different nutrients at different pH levels, or I should say different nutrients are more readily available to plants at different pH levels. That pH level is not neutral. It's typically slightly acidic. So depending on what type of nutrients your plant requires, depending on which stage of growth it's in, you might be looking for a slightly lower or a slightly higher pH. And then there are chemicals that are sold to increase or decrease their pH, pretty simply called pH up, pH down. But you can also experiment with your students, right? So this is an area where the curriculum can really shine. So the students can experiment with different materials that might increase or decrease the pH of their water outside of those commercial chemicals, which is where it can really get fun. Something to be cautious of if you're going to be using commercial plant nutrients here is that most communities' tap water already has conductivity in it, right? So unless you have distilled water coming out of the tap in your lab, it's unlikely that you're going to just have a straight up zero conductivity reading. So it's important to recognize whether or not the conductivity or dissolved minerals in your water are already pretty high, because you'll have to use that as a baseline when you consider what you're adding to it and to what level you're trying to achieve, right? So typically with our seedlings, we're looking at a 700 to 800 microsiemen conductivity, whereas for our adult plants, we might be looking for something much higher, 1200 to 1600, right? But I know that our tap water in my lab is, baseline like 300 to 400. So that's something my students have to take into consideration when they're testing the water later to see if the nutrients have really been lowered in the water, or if some of that is just distillation, right? So even if you have evaporative loss, you can increase the concentration of those minerals in your water. And the last thing is oxygen. So oxygen is really, really important. No matter which distribution system you're using, there has to be some way for the water to become oxygenated. Otherwise, your roots will rot and your plant really won't be very happy. So again, if anybody's ever done any home propagation, even just putting some of their cilantro in water from the grocery store to stick in the fridge to keep it good until the next time they want to use it, you recognize that it will get kind of slimy and skunky if it's sitting in there too long, because the plant will use up the oxygen, even if it develops roots, or especially if it develops roots, those cells will use up the oxygen that's in the water and it'll get kind of anaerobic. So when we're running a hydroponic system, if it is a stagnant system, if it's a system where the water doesn't move very much, you're going to want to add oxygen to it. And that's where you can include just like an at-home aquarium pump, something very, very simple with a little air stone to just add dissolved oxygen to the water. If you are running an ebb and flow system, a lot of times the movement of the water is going to be enough to oxygenate that water, as long as you're not growing in super high concentration. So if you've got a ton of biomass using the water, then you might want to add oxygen to it, just like you would for a fish tank that has a high biomass. Any place that you're going to use a lot of oxygen, you're going to want to make sure you add that oxygen in to supplement. But again, everything you control, you have to control. So if your system relies on having extra oxygen, and for some reason your pump breaks, you're going to be in trouble. So you want to, if you have a system that exhibits a lot of human control, where you're really trying to make sure all these variables are right where they need to be, just know that you don't have the backup that might come with a typical plant in a pot, right? Where the soil's got all kinds of biological backup happening for you, where that soil can hang on to moisture. If your water distribution system shuts down in hydroponics, then there's no water getting to the medium that you have your plants growing in. So just be cautious. The more complicated your system gets, just the more aware you have to be of which things can break when. And again, there's nothing wrong with starting with a really basic system. In fact, I would highly, highly recommend it, because that's where the students can get most involved. All right. So then our plants, right? So this is a huge can of worms to open, right? Because this itself is a topic wherein lots of people will have opinions about which things do better in hydroponics than others. They'll tell you which things to absolutely not try, to not do. And I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to suggest some that I've used with some success under different circumstances. And I've had some plants that absolutely hate growing hydroponically. But also it could have just been that we never found that right climate. We never found the right growing conditions for them yet. So it's one of those challenges that's really kind of a fun challenge to encounter, right? Like, I've never been able to grow this thing, but could I if I got things just right? And that is a really fun question to explore with your students, right? And it's a really great opportunity to fail with your students, right? So like when something dies, you just have to really look at all the considerations, right? Like what went wrong, do that kind of postmortem and figure out where in the system there was a problem. And that is where so much learning can happen. But in terms of plants, bean plants are really, really great. They grow really quickly, as many people know. The seeds are really big, which is great for little hands. So if you're working in elementary school or younger, the bean seeds are really easy to work with. If you're not working with a large seed, again, I would recommend you can get these pelleted seeds. So these have kind of a coating of clay on top of them. There's no way you're going to be able to see that. But this otherwise, what would otherwise be a really, really tiny seed is now significantly larger because it's got this coating of clay around it. I will say that it is really important, especially in a hydroponic system where your grow medium might not be really wet all the time. That clay doesn't necessarily want to dissolve on itself really easily. So maybe getting it moist or germinating it externally outside of your grow medium and then moving your germinated plants to where you're growing them. But otherwise, if you're going with something other than a bean plant where the bean seeds are really large, it might be useful to have a pelletized seed, especially if we're working with little ones. For older kids, it's sometimes really just fun to watch them challenge themselves with really, really tiny seeds. Leafy greens are super useful because they also grow really quickly. They germinate really fast. And because there's so much leaf there, it's an excellent opportunity to really look at how the plant responds to different nutrient levels. We know that leafy greens are really nitrogen loving plants. So our nutrient mix can be pretty simple for them. There's lots of commercial mixes out there for growing leafy greens. The same mixes that can be used for leafy greens can also be used for a lot of the herbs if you're growing at different temperatures. If you're growing in a place that is typically kind of cool in temperature, the leafy greens will do really well. But even if it's a place that's warm, the nice thing about leafy greens, if you're doing plant cycle, is that they'll bolt pretty quickly and they'll go to the seed cycle and they'll grow their flowers and try to develop seeds. And most kids don't recognize that lettuce will have flowers eventually, right? So that can be really useful. But if you're playing around with different nutrient concentrations, the leafy greens are an excellent place to make those observations about what a plant might look like if it is lacking in nitrogen, or if you give it a toxic amount of nitrogen. And then fruiting plants, I would certainly say are your most challenging, primarily for the fact that if you want them to fruit, they need to be pollinated, and they don't all want to pollinate themselves very easily. We were growing these tomato plants specifically so we could mess around with different pollination techniques, because typically they're ones that I wouldn't say require a pollinator, but strongly benefit from having a pollinator. But yeah, so fruiting plants are good too, especially if you're looking for the whole plant life cycle. All right, so let's get into a few examples. So this is where I wanted to be able to be in my lab to show you what I had here. So I don't know if Simca, you want to take off screen sharing just for a minute here, or I don't know, for a few minutes, I guess. All right, so I'll share with you the first one. This is the one that we've been working on most recently in my class. All right, so this is a deep water culture, but as you can tell, it's really not a deep water culture. It's a really shallow water culture. We call it a deep water culture because the plants and their roots are just dangling into a water reservoir. So I don't really need to distribute my water here. I just need to make sure that my water level stays high enough for the roots of my plants to get into the water. And the main thing that's lovely about this one is that it's super, super, super cheap to build. This is just a shoebox sized Rubbermaid container. I drilled 2 holes in the top of it. I have in here commercial grow cups. So these ones are meant to allow water to pass through them. We have a root ball inside of this grow cup. The entire thing's submerged, so I'm not worried about all of the water escaping or the roots dangling out of the bottom. For this part of your setup, I have very successfully just used plastic cups that I melted or drilled holes into, or even poked holes into. You just need the water to be able to enter and exit the cup. That's all that's necessary there. So you don't have to get too extreme. You can even use a piece of netting or something along those lines. It should be somewhat durable though, because remember, it's going to be sitting in water all the time, and water wreaks havoc on stuff. So if it is something that will eventually start to degrade or dissolve in water, even some cloths, then I would kind of steer clear of it. For the starting plants in this, I didn't want to get too crazy. I wanted to get this going with my kids right away. The lab that this is for with my students is not meant to take them from seed to harvest necessarily. That's not the point. The point of this lab for them is to be able to manage the nutrient solution in the water, the oxygen levels in the water, the pH of the water. So I wasn't so concerned with the plants. So I bought just some hydroponic basil at the grocery store and just kept it going from the farm that sent it to us, right? So it was already started hydroponically. I think it cost $2 for this giant bundle of basil that then divided into 2 chunks. So all in all, I think this setup would maybe cost, I don't know, like $5 to $7 total if you did all of this in one place, outside of your oxygen. So you will notice this little tube here. I've got an air stone inside there. So you would just require some kind of oxygen contribution to the system. I have played around with my students just adding it manually, right? So we might have a straw that we use to add oxygen in periodically. It, depending on, again, how much biomass you have going, it can go really well, can go really poorly. You can run it as 2 different variables, right? One with an air stone that has oxygen all the time, one that you add manually occasionally, and see if it makes any difference to your plants. The students will observe the leaves on this just to see where we have new growth forming, how quickly that growth is forming. They'll observe the nutrient toxicity levels or deficiency levels in the colors of the leaves. So we'll look at some comparisons, right? So we have some color cards where we look at leaves that are doing really well versus leaves that might be doing kind of poorly on either end. And then there's lots of great resources online for kind of doing plant pathology to kind of identify what might be going right or wrong with a plant. So this is my really, really simple deep water culture system. This one we set up recently, but I've had pretty good success with it. And funny enough, this is exactly how I learned hydroponics the first time back when I was in college. So the professor had us setting up in Rubbermaid containers with our plants. The difference was there we were mixing our own nutrients because we weren't getting commercial nutrients for that lab. But that's our first setup. So that is our deep water culture tabletop setup. The nice thing about them being low cost is that you could have multiple groups of students working on them in the classroom at the same time because the expense is low. And rather than having to just do like one classroom demo for 25 kids, that would be less valuable to the kids, right? This one out of the way. All right, our second one is an aquaponics setup. So this one, again, very inexpensive, very simple, and it can be done in multiple ways. So I've done a variety of different ways to set this up. You can see our roots dangling down below. This is just a little plant raft, right? So our plant cuttings, so these were all propagated plants just from house plants. They are in Rockwool plugs, although again, you can use whatever you want for your grow medium that would work with this. This is just a nursery tray that just happened to have the right size holes in the bottom and it fit in my tank. So I used this one, although I've used pieces of plexiglass or just pieces of plastic that I've cut out from the side of like broken recycling bins and then just add some kind of flotation to the bottom. These are little film canisters that I had kicking around with zip ties. I've done it with foam noodles before. I've done it with empty water bottles before. You can do all kinds of stuff to repurpose what would otherwise be trash, because all you really need is something that is waterproof, so that can stay in the water, because it's going to be in the water all the time, and that will float. So these rock wool plugs hold our cuttings in place. The roots dangle down into, this is in a goldfish tank right now, just because goldfish love to reduce waste, and they're simple to keep. And they don't mind the roots. In fact, they like to swim in amongst the roots. The kids like to watch them swim around in them. And the way we use this is not to demonstrate plant production, right? Like we would be with the basil, thinking about how we can monitor and change our nutrients for plant production. This one is a way for us to more naturally bioremediate our tank, right? So these roots are taking things out of the water that would otherwise dirty our fish tank. And so the plants are doing our fish a solid, right? But we can also use this when we talk again about the cycling of matter and energy and nutrient cycling in ecosystems and the role that each of these organisms might play in one of these systems. So again, pretty simple setup. You can set it up in a lot of different ways. This one is, I set them up as a raft because especially in the winter months, our tanks lose a lot of moisture, right? So the humidity in the classroom is really low. The tanks will evaporate tons of water out. If I set this up on top of the tank to dangle into the water, that's fine when you've got long, happy root systems like this. But if it's a relatively new plant to the propagation or to hydroponics, it might not have very long roots yet. And you could kill your plant in like a weekend, right? If it can't reach that water, then it won't be able to get the water that it needs and the nutrients it needs. Again, it's going to be important because now we've got not just plant biomass in the water, but we've got fish biomass in the water to ensure that there's enough oxygen for everything that's living there. So if you have a fish tank and the fish are doing well there, that means there's enough oxygen for them to survive. If you put an aquatic plant in, well, that aquatic plant arguably is creating oxygen for the system, right? And so they're not necessarily going to change the net oxygen levels in the tank. This plant is not creating oxygen for the tank. This plant is creating oxygen for the atmosphere outside of the tank. So we want to make sure that when we're adding biomass in addition to our fish, we don't make it an unhealthy situation for our fish. So something to consider when you're doing aquaponics is not to overwhelm the system too quickly in a way where you could hurt your fish. But yeah, that's our little float. I got one more to show you. So this is just a piece of PVC. This one does not have the holes yet cut into it. This is a new one for my students to work on. But if you wanted to be able to showcase your hydroponics in your classroom in a different way, so either aquaponics or hydroponics, the source reservoir doesn't matter with this. What you're going to do is you're going to cut a small hole into the closed end of your pipe. And that's where your inlet's going to go in, your water supply. So if the water is being pumped out of your fish tank into here, that works. If the water is being pumped out of a nutrient reservoir into here, that's fine. And then you use a hole saw to then drill holes in the top. That will then be where you put your plant cups in. The cool thing about this system is that you can have it empty right back into your tank. So I keep the elbows on these loose, that I don't glue them. And a lot of times I'll put a reducer on, so it's not like the same size elbow. This is the one I had handy for a demo, but a lot of times it'll be a reducer and then a small 45-degree elbow. And then what you do is you just turn the end of the pipe. So you can turn the fitting, not necessarily the entire pipe, but you can turn the fitting to have the water spill out at different rates. So if I turn it, the water will spill out more easily, and that helps us to regulate the water level inside the pipe. So we can increase the depth of the water in the pipe for our plants, or we can decrease it so it's just a film of water running along the bottom, but that's up to us. And so I have had these running on top of my turtle tanks in my classroom before, fish tanks in my classroom. I've also had them just on top of bins of nutrient solution and water to showcase at a really small scale what hydroponics can look like. And again, this can be made pretty inexpensively from supplies that you can just get at your local hardware store. So you're not going too crazy. One like this, you don't necessarily need the oxygen input because when the water's dumping back into the tank, it's usually adding a lot of oxygen to the system. But it does require that you have some form of pump to get the water out of your tank into the system. So you can either do like an airlift pump or just a simple submersible pump. Or if you're feeling really crafty, you can just cut the hole big enough to have your aquarium filter dump right into your PVC. We've done that before as well. So you can do 2 open ends. So like this side, and have your aquarium pump dump or return right back into your pipe, have the water run through your pipe, and then go back into your tank, creating your nutrient film system. Yeah. All right. So those are the samples I wanted to showcase. I hope that's helpful. We can go back to the slideshow. All right. So what we have next, I think, is we get into our content, right? So there's no point in doing any of this if it's not helping our kids to learn the content, right? So I'm a science teacher, so I immediately went to science, right? These are the next generation science standards. So we've got life science here, physical science, and earth science on this page. Don't feel the need to read all of these. Some of you probably know all of these verbatim, but if you go back to the recording later, if you wanted to look through this kind of collection of standards later, these are all ones that I've identified to be useful for hydroponics, right? So we can look at balances of matter and energy in a system, right? So be thinking about, when a plant materializes, where is that material coming from? And it helps students to really think about the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, if you're doing that in your class. And how those things then assimilate into the plant. And then what would then happen if we were to break that plant back down again and then return it back into the system again? When our fish are producing waste, but our tank is not getting dirty from that waste, where's that waste going? So we can really ask those bigger questions to then begin a hydroponic unit, right? So you ask the questions about where waste goes if nothing is wasted in nature, and then you create an aquaponic system wherein the kids can see the value of the waste to that system. When we're looking at some of our earth science concepts, the earth and space sciences, that we can be thinking about agriculture and what agriculture or the future of agriculture might look like in different parts of the world, or in places where the temperatures are really arid, right? And water supplies are dwindling, right? So hydroponic systems are an excellent way to really control how much water we're using in a system, because a lot of times they can be run as closed systems where we're not just tossing water out into a field, we're maintaining it in a closed loop system where we can really watch how much we're using at any given time. Many of the hydroponic, the kind of commercial hydroponic growing systems are also in big hothouses or greenhouses, so they can control the water loss there as well. All right, we're gonna go to the next one. All right, and so then there's really, really obvious connections when we get into our engineering and design standards, and then the cross-cutting concepts that we'll find in those NGSS frameworks. So when we're trying to think about analyzing patterns or doing systems thinking, so I know that for my classes, we do a tremendous amount of systems thinking and systems analysis, where we'll do causal loops, but then we'll try to take those causal loops and build them into stock and flow diagrams, where you can really see how the stock in one variable is influencing the stock in another variable. And when we do our hydroponic systems, it allows us to really control all of the variables in that system that we're trying to analyze, and it provides students the opportunity to really measure those quantifiable variables, right? So where pH is changing and how that pH change is influencing the system at large. And then with our engineering design, you can also just have the students build their own system, right? Like if they know what needs to go into a hydroponic system, and you introduce them to all of the varieties of ways, or you give them a design challenge wherein they have to fit that hydroponic system into a situation that isn't super obvious or easy, then it can be really an excellent design challenge for them. My mentor teacher here, when he first started at the high school many years ago, he was growing hydroponically on a barge in Marblehead Harbor. He had a fish tank on the boat, and he had hydroponics on the boat, and he called it the bio barge, and it was all green energy. Just had solar panels and wind turbines, so it can be done in amazing places. I know that Salem State University, they have experiments happening over the bridge in Beverly right now, where they're really looking at aquaponic systems and how those aquaponic systems could potentially bring food to places in the world that need food in a much more sustainable way, which is a good caveat for the next one, right? So this is another place where we can make those curricular connections. So if we're thinking about why we might have a hydroponic system in our classroom, you can incorporate a lot of these global sustainable development goals, right, from the United Nations into those kind of lesson designs, right, or those unit designs when we're thinking about clean water and sanitation. And if you have a place that has limited clean water to start with, you have to be really careful about how you utilize that clean water. But in addition to that, there are places in the world where they're using duckweed, Lemna minor, to clean their water, right? So to pull some of those excess nutrients out. And what is that Lemna doing when it's floating in that water? It's hydroponic system, right? So we've got a deep water culture system there that the water's flowing through to help clean that water, not for the sake of the lemna, but for the sake of the water. So there's some really creative ways that you can identify where in the world people are using these systems for other than just, growing really fancy tomatoes. But yeah, so this is the basis for my environmental systems class now. And we find a lot of excellent places to think about how we're growing food in more creative ways. And one of those big ways is hydroponics. All right. So that leaves us with about 10 minutes for questions and answers. I think that timing worked out pretty well.
Yeah, so again, if you have questions for Graeme, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A, and we can try and answer those live. And we will be sharing out the slides. So if there's things about, specific standards or some of the resources that Graeme mentioned, we will make those available for sure.
There were 2 links I included on the resources page that I think is at the very end of the slideshow that will get shared out. One of them is an excellent workbook for primarily K-5 hydroponic systems use development connections in the classroom. And then another one that is a beginner's guide for classroom hydroponics from ZipGrow, which is it's a company that produces hydroponic supplies, but they obviously have a vested interest in people doing hydroponics in the classroom. And that was the other thing I didn't even mention. Like, you can buy hydroponic systems. I mean, Carolina Biological sells them. Everybody sells them. They're really expensive and they can take up a lot of space. So my recommendation would be do some DIY systems, see if they fit your curriculum well before you buy something that's going to take up a lot of closet space if it doesn't work out.
Great. Any other questions for Graeme? Well, let me pull back up some of the other resources that we had in the slide. I also just kind of want to put on there that for those of you guys who want to stay up to date on other webinars or other professional learning opportunities we have, I'd encourage you to subscribe to the Mass Farm to School newsletter if you haven't already. And this is a link to the ZipGrow resource that Graeme mentioned, as well as something from the National Farm to School Network about exploring hydroponics. And finally, also just want to put out there our contact information if you want to follow up with questions, myself, and then my colleague Dinah, who is our education program manager and typically helping facilitate these sessions, but was actually at an environmental education conference today, so couldn't make it. But if you do want to connect directly with other farm to school practitioners and other educators who are really incorporating some of these themes into their classrooms, registration is open for just a couple more days for our conference coming up on March 22nd. You can find more info about that on our website as well. We'd love to see any of you guys there. And so I will stop sharing again and see if we've got, I don't think we've had any questions come in. So
Okay.
I want to thank you so much, Graeme, for sharing your incredible wealth of knowledge about hydroponics with us today. It's really inspiring to see what your students are having a chance to learn in such an incredible hands-on way. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks everyone for being here today, and have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.